would forget, but all right. Okay. Aloha, mai kako, and naimbag. I guess it's naimbag ma'alem yo amin. In Japan, it's like 11:30 in the morning right now, so it's a little bit different. But anyways, thank you all for joining us today. My name is Rebecca Maria Goldschmidt. I am representing Laing Hawaiʻi. We are a sort of social justice oriented language acquisition program slash school organization based in Hawaii. And what we do is offer language program and cultural programming in mostly Philippine languages like Ilocano, Visayan, Cebuano. But we also have been opening up to doing more wellness workshops and cultural and social justice workshops to continue educating and learning from our communities. So we're really, really lucky and excited today to be working with HiCHRP, with two amazing organizers from the Hawaii Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines. Yoko and Manang RC are here to basically break down a lot of the issues that are happening in the Philippines, some of the context of what's going on there now and has been going on in the past years and decades, and how that relates to what's happening in Hawaii. So we're really, really happy that you all have joined us. We're going to be recording the session today, so if there are notes that you want to take or you want to go back later, you'll have this as a reference. But if you do have questions, we want you to put them today into the chat, and we're going to come back for a Q&A at the end. So Yoko and Manang RC are going to give a presentation, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end. So please save your questions, and I'll be monitoring the chat, so feel free to drop them in there while it's happening. And yeah, you can visit, we'll plug this more at the end, but you can visit both of our websites for more information on the stuff that we do. And HiCHRP does have regular meetings, so if you're interested in joining them, that's a great way to get more involved and understanding, you know, what's happening in Hawaii, especially around demilitarization and how that overlaps between the two places. So I don't want to say much more than that, but I'm just really happy. I'm really grateful to be here. I love both of these amazing activists and peacemaking people. So I'm going to pass the mic on to you all. Agyaman kami. And yeah, let me know if you have any tech issues as well. I can help with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Right, so HiCHRP, we are a grassroots organization for human rights in the Philippines. We are in a larger global formation called HiCHRP, the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines. We are rooted and connected to the mass struggle in the Philippines by doing our part as where we can in Hawaii and in the United States as well, in terms of lobbying and awareness building and action. We mobilize for different calls by the Filipino people, and we want to end our tax money going to the Philippines and so on. So those are different ways that we engage in struggle. So now RC will be giving a background on the Philippines, and then we'll be talking about connecting the Philippines to Hawaii. We'll be talking about the current human rights situation in the Philippines, and then the different ways our struggles in Hawaii and in the Philippines are connected, and what we can do moving forward. And if you have questions, right, just put them in the chat and we'll try to get to them. And then there will be also an open discussion at the end. And we will also be interspersing music throughout our presentation.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is RC Masa. I'm a Filipino settler in Hawaii. So my migration to Hawaii was made possible through connections of my family to the Filipinos that came to Hawaii during the plantation time in early 20th century. I take an active part in the Hawaii Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines, and I'm joining Yoko today in this webinar and Rebecca as well. So this is an honor for me to be here and share and as well as learn from all of you. So to start off, let's give a little bit of background about the Philippines as a country, as a nation. So you can see the global map, like see where the Philippines is. So the Philippines is a country in Southeast Asia and situated in the Western Pacific Ocean. It is an archipelago, consists of more than 7,000 islands. Yeah, so it's pretty big. Next slide. So the Philippines has been called the Pearl of the Orient Sea because of its elegant organic beauty. When this label was given in the 18th century by the colonizers, it was well known for its precious source of spices and other resources, trade goods. Yeah. So the Philippines still remains so rich in natural resources. The fact is, it is considered a prime state by the United States. Yeah, very rich country. Next slide. So to understand the human rights situation in the Philippines, it requires an understanding of the history of the Philippines as a country, as a nation, as well as its current economic and political situation. Yeah, that's very important. So Philippine society is considered semi-feudal and semi-colonial land when we look at its economy, politics, military, culture, and foreign relations, of course. Yeah, it is semi-feudal because its national development is restricted. Yeah, and its economy is bankrupt while maintaining a large masses of Filipino people in that feudal bondage. You know, you're bond to the land. So you're really dependent on the land. So this is so to create a relative surplus of population and a huge reserve army of labor that keeps the local labor market cheap for the international powers. Yeah, so semi-feudal in that way. Inflation, high prices are the biggest issues in the Philippine economy. These are two major problems that people are really suffering from. So the Philippine government enacted laws that favor the rich and through corporate tax cuts. For most Filipinos who are poor in poverty, of course, this only means more suffering. Yeah. So income is severely low for many Filipinos, and because of the inflation and high taxes, they continue to lose, a portion of that income that they're already getting, which is not much. Yeah, so in terms of foreign debt, very important point too, the Philippines running debt balance actually like ballooned to a new record high of 11 trillion pesos in 2021. So it just keeps shooting up this amount of debt. So this amount translates to each Filipino citizen owing the World Bank at least 106,000 pesos. Yeah, so a Filipino's not even born yet, but there's already a debt waiting for that Filipino. The Philippines has a very good number of labor force, very high, working force there, but unemployment and underemployment is very high as well. So people are losing jobs in agriculture, manufacturing, and wholesale and retail trade. So what are the options to find job? They go abroad. Yeah, more Filipinos are deployed for work abroad than the number of new jobs created in the local economy. Actually, Filipinos migrate abroad every year, as much as or equivalent of 6,000 people per day. We're talking about per day here. Yeah, 6,000. Yeah, that's how much we rely on the jobs that are offered abroad. So we leave our country, we migrate abroad. Next slide. So the Philippines, besides being a semi-feudal, is also a semi-colony as a country, which means it is officially an independent sovereign country or nation, but in reality is very much dependent and dominated by another imperialist country, which is the US in the Philippine case, yeah. So this means at the fundamental core, the Philippines is still a colonial possession or a neo-colony and under control by the US. So that's the Duterte government, which is the incumbent government right now, is really subservient to the impositions of the international economy. Actually, the economic managers of the Philippine government are actually trained by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. They are experts that really got training from these international institutions that loan money to countries, yeah. And also we have political dynasty that rule in the government as fascist and corrupt puppets. And then besides the economic control aspect, the United States has a strong military presence and control in the Philippines, of course, through lopsided agreements such as visiting forces agreement, and through ensuring that we have US trained military officials in the Duterte's governments, yeah, who will, of course, favor this lopsided agreements coming from the US. So you can imagine really a rotten nature of the Philippine economy and its social politics, yeah. And definitely, all countries are, experiencing crisis currently because of the pandemic, but what's going on in the Philippines does not provide a good way of resolving that crisis, yeah. It's very obvious to everyone that the Philippine government really prioritizes the interests of the ruling class, and then they're pocketing money that's supposed to go to the services for the people during this pandemic. Next slide. So in the southern part of the Philippines, which is Mindanao, that is considered the food basket for the country because the soil is just very rich. It has impressive capability to produce food. Unfortunately, it is also the site for so many plantations that are owned by multinational corporations. For that very same reason, yeah. The Philippines is also the 5th most mineral-rich country in the world for gold, nickel, copper, and chromite. Because of that, it is the site of many mining resources owned by foreign corporations. According to WikiLeaks, Mindanao alone has $1 trillion worth in mineral wealth. But currently, it's estimated that 93% of the mineral wealth of the Philippines is taken by foreign big mining corporations over the past 20 years. So you can imagine, like, our resources are not benefited by our own people, yeah. So how do foreign corporations keep control of these resources? Of course, by instilling fear among local farmers and indigenous communities in the Philippines. And this fear is actually created through increased militarization, including aerial strikes, indiscriminate bombings, killings of peasant leaders and activists. This way, mining corporations can continue to extract wealth from their lands. Yeah. So I am gonna show a song here. Hope you guys will like it. This song shows the unequal relationship between the Philippines and the US.
Nais kong isalaysay ang yaring kasaysayan ng dalawang magkaibigan. Ang kwento ni Juan at ni Itong si Sam ay dumayo sa bayan ni Juan katutubo. Dala-dala niya ay plato na wala namang naman kahit ano. Si Juan kanyang kinaibigan, gumawa pa siya ng kasunduan. Sabi ni Sam, sagot niya ang pinggan, si Juan naman daw ang bahala sa laman. Nang mapuno na itong pinggan, na handa na sanang paghatian, wala ang pinggan kasama ang laman, ninakaw ng tusong si Sam. Dahil sa pangyayari nakita ni Juan, nagalit pa itong si Sam. Dapat daw ay bayaran ang nawawalang pinggan. Kawawang si Juan, nabaon sa utang. Nang mabayaran ni Juan, pinggang sanhi ng pagkakautang. Pagnanakaw ay muling inulit ni Sam, subalit nakita ni Juan. And dahil sa nakita'y nagalit si Juan, ang dugo pumutok na parang bulkan. Nang dahil sa nakita'y nagalit si Juan, pinggan ay binasag sa ulo ni Sam. Dahil sa nakita'y nagalit si Juan, sa nakita ay nagalit si Juan, pinggan ay binasag sa ulo ni Sam.
RC, do you want to just talk about it? No, unmute.
Sorry. Yeah, so that song was illustration of, you know, the unequal relationship between the US and the Philippines, where were you guys able to hear the sound, the music? Yes, yeah. I think Dr. Yamada seems like didn't. Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so basically, so it was in Tagalog language, but basically the US came to Philippines, and then Juan or John, you know, the representation of the Filipino people, offered food initially to fill up the plate. So the time, but then the US was tuso, meaning, what is tuso in English? Very greedy, wanted everything, and then keep using up all the food, taking the food from Juan until and never reciprocated that kindness or goodness from Juan. And then eventually Juan realized it, and then kind of like rose up and fought Sam. Yeah.
Thank you for that background on the Philippines. And so now we want to connect Hawaii and the Philippines. We just want to be really explicit. I think in our daily lives as people living in Hawaii, we could probably see some connections, but we really want to draw them out for all of us. So Hawaii and the Philippines are distinct nations, and they had their own functioning societies for hundreds, if not thousands of years before colonialism, and they were ravaged by colonialism, and those effects are seen to this day. One way is that the Philippines and Hawaii are connected is through US imperialism. Something must be happening in the Super Bowl. There are multiple military installations in Hawaii that are used as launching pads to the Pacific and Asia, and that includes the Philippines. For this next part, I would like a volunteer to read. This is directly from the National Park Service website for Pearl Harbor. Can I get, actually, Rebecca, can you read it?
Why, yes, I can, Yoko. Despite gaining exclusive rights to Pearl Harbor in 1887, the United States did not make any attempt to take advantage of their claim on this strategic estuary until well after the turn of the century. It wasn't until the capture of Manila during the Spanish-American War when the United States needed to establish a permanent way station in the Pacific to maintain control of the Philippines. Then, for the first time, the American government began to understand the strategic importance of Oahu.
Yeah, did folks know about that? That Pearl Harbor wasn't even a strategic location, wasn't a permanent installation until they decided that it was a perfect place to control the Philippines. That's wild. Labor connects the Philippines to Hawaii. Soon after the establishment of Pearl Harbor, the sugar plantations recruited Filipino workers starting in 1906, and then first started with 15 and then hundreds, and then more and more started to come for work. And we see this even to this day in not so much of plantations anymore, but in different sectors, different industries in Hawaii. So now we're gonna go into that was just a brief overview of how we're connected. We'll be revisiting that theme, that concept of connecting Hawaii and the Philippines. But for now, we're gonna go back to the Philippines, and RC is gonna talk to us about what's currently happening in the human rights situation.
Thanks, Yoko. So now let's provide the context as well as the updates on the we can call grim human rights situation in the Philippines. So it's next slide. Yoko. Yeah, so it's almost 36 years. I had to do calculation earlier. Yeah, it's been 36 years since the Filipino people ousted dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Yeah, a lot of us may not been born at the time, but when Marcos and his martial law were defeated, it was clearly a result of the people's movement that united to overthrow tyranny. Unfortunately, in the past 6 years, we're actually confronted an even more brutal regime that of Duterte. So there were estimated 30,000 or more folks killed in Duterte's drug war, which is actually a failed drug war. Yeah, it did not stop the drug crimes in the country. And most of the victims of these killings are the urban poor. The Duterte government also engaged with the COVID pandemic, the militarized response, using laws that are very anti-people, anti-poor, and also allowed widespread corruption and use of public funds for the ruling elite. and there is continuing sellout of Philippine sovereignty. So with all these facts, Duterte has actually exceeded Marcos's crimes against the people. Next slide. So the Duterte's war against the poor and his critics followed the kill, kill, kill policy. So just shoot everyone who's against him and his policies. And also through military operation plans or OPLAN. Yeah, we have this term in the Philippines, OPLAN, whatever. These are military operation plans that are US funded, trained, and equipped. Specifically, the Operation Pacific Eagle in 2007 is part of the US War on Terror counterinsurgency plan with unlimited budget to counter the violent, quote unquote, violent extremism, radicalism. And in fact, the Philippines received almost $4 billion in counterterrorism aid from the US. So that's how much our money is going to fund this activities in the Philippines. You can see the table here, almost 200, the victims of extrajudicial killings, almost 200 of those killed in military operations are farmers. Many of them were killed during massacres. Yeah, even lawyers, journalists, and group leaders, cause-oriented group leaders are being targeted and extrajudicially killed. But there is zero accountability. We have this international arena or avenues to file cases against these human rights violations, but so far there has been no accountability from the Duterte government. 500,000 people are displaced during militarizations to drive resistance away from the mining businesses and foreign-owned plantations. There's also this indigenous people's schools that were forcibly closed, denying education to children of indigenous communities. Next slide. So the Duterte's critics, including activists, are being red tagged. Have you guys heard of the word or a phrase red tagging? Red tagging basically happens in the Philippines right now. That refers to this malicious blacklisting of individuals or organizations critical or not fully supportive of the actions of the Duterte government. So you're against the Duterte government, you could be red tagged. Yeah. So when you're red tagged, your government says you're either a communist or a terrorist or both. And the security forces, military or police will be out to get you because you're red tagged. So the use of red tagging really undermines the democracy, due process. Yeah. So it really, at its core, it aims to stifle dissent, and it encourages assassinations and retaliations, really. Yeah. So the Philippines signed in, I believe, July 2020, the Anti-Terrorism Law, ATL, which actually uses this vague, broad definitions of terrorism and applies to all Filipinos, both in the Philippines and outside of the Philippines, so including us here in Hawaii, in the US continent, and everywhere else. Yeah, so that applies, that ATL or anti-terrorism law applies to everyone. So it is being and will be used to arrest activists and opposition, under that red tagging policy. So the Duterte government right now targets environmental activists, indigenous leaders, particularly from the Cordillera People's Alliance that's in the north of the Philippines, all the way from the north to the south, to the Lumad indigenous peoples in the southern Philippines. Even this is so funny, but really like infuriating when the United Nations special rapporteur on indigenous people's rights went to the Philippines a few years back. She was actually on that list too, you know, that terror listing that the Philippine government keeps. It's crazy. And of course, all of this in an effort to intimidate, disrupt, criminalize activism in the Philippines. Next slide. So recently, there's a case of it's a really heinous crime that was brought up to the public through a 15-year-old female named Belle. Belle was kidnapped, tortured, and raped. So I'll give you some time to read here. This crime, human rights violation, was committed between July to August 2020. So she was abducted, illegally abducted, and then really they tortured her to force her to speak about rebel activities in the community. But once she was able to get out of the camp, you know, she talked about her experiences. And then actually SOLCOM here is the Southern Luzon Command of the military, actually tried to put a different story about her to really discredit her case. So rape and many other forms of violence against women is a policy that is also promoted by the Duterte administration among its police and soldiers. And that's very known to a lot of us in the media. You know, there's always the news about Philippine Duterte or the Philippine government, you know, publicly saying, you know, just shoot everyone, rape women if they're against Duterte. Next slide. So lastly, the Philippines is going to have a major political event through the upcoming national elections in May 2022 this year. These elections will be happening under a government whose policies include the ATL, the Anti-Terrorism Act, that really emboldens the police and military to attack activists, peasant leaders, and indigenous peoples. So this suggests that those charged with protecting the polls are potential perpetrators of election violence and fraud. And we say this because historically Philippine elections have been characterized by, you know, this inter-elite rivalries, warlordism, assassinations, vote buying, corruption, everything you can think of, intimidation, and other forms of violence. We have that 3 Gs that always comes up during elections: guns, goons, and gold. So all of this that I mentioned creates that backdrop of a grave human rights record under the Duterte government. Your turn, Yako.
Arcy wanted us to play this song as an interlude.
She fears for the lives of her parents. She fears for the life of her friend. She trembles when she hears a blast from the distance. Oh God, when will this war come to an end? She opens the window at daybreak and cries at the sight of her friend. The head is detached from the body. Oh God, when will this war come to an end? As the battle rages around her, she lights up a candle to see. Beside her, her mother is gasping for breath. Oh God, when will this war come to an end? heard from her father. It's a war between greed and righteousness. Would it help if you keep on asking the question, oh God, when will this war come to an end? Scarred as she was, she stands on her feet, knowing that the culprit is profit and greed, resolving herself the question, oh God, when will this war come to an end? Scarred as she was, she stands on her feet, knowing that the culprit is profit and greed, resolving herself the question, oh God, when will this war come to an end? Oh God, when will this war come to an end? Come to an end. Come to an end. Oh God, when will this war come to an end?
Yeah. Yeah, so the Hawaii Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines hosts meetings every first Monday of the month. So just let us know, send us an email if you want to get information regarding these meetings. We will welcome you, of course, and then we usually get updates, give updates about the human rights situation in the Philippines, and then all about talk about our upcoming events and activities, and of course always linking our struggles to the local struggles that we have in Hawaii and also in the continent.
So now we'll talk about more linking of our struggles. So even though we have so many societal ills, much of our tax money does not go to social programs, but instead to fund human rights atrocities around the world, if not directly by drone bombings. It's selling the drones to a government like Duterte's, and they drop the bombs, for instance. And our US tax dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, at least $500 million has gone to as military aid to the Duterte government. This doesn't include the arms sales of attack helicopters and drones and bombs and artillery that is also sold to the Philippines. And when the Philippines can't buy it, they also subsidize those costs. So there is these indirect ways that taxpayer money goes to military aid in the Philippines. US forces do joint military exercises in the Philippines. So even our Senator HiCHRP has told us that he has done balikatan exercises on more than one occasion in the Philippines, which means that US armed troops go to the Philippines and they do war games in the countryside. And oftentimes this means that there's degradation of land, there's stray bullets. They've also accidentally killed Philippine soldiers before. There's been a botanist who's been killed in the crossfire many years ago, and communities who are affected that have to clear out because of these operations as well, also funded by our tax money. All of these issues, these popular struggle issues are connected. RIMPAC, Philippines is a participant in RIMPAC that we host here in Hawaii. The bombings of Pohakuloa, of Makua, these are trial runs, right? For bombings around the world, especially in the Pacific and in the Philippines. those aerial bombs that are dropping on farmer communities in Samar, Leyte, Negros are directly from the US. Whether it's like new or, you know, things that we're passing on. Yeah. And then large scale mining and different large scale multinational corporations are often based in the US. And devastating the natural resources in the Philippines and the indigenous communities that are trying to protect them, that are being killed just for trying to defend their land. There's a company trying to do a green geothermal energy. There's geothermal energy projects on the Big Island of Mauna Kea, I believe, that are similar to the geothermal project of Chevron in the Cordilleras that are affecting, displacing, and killing indigenous peoples in the Philippines. The poisoning of water and infrastructure is something that we see across the world that the US does and is doing here in Hawaii and in the Philippines. Both Hawaii and the Philippines have rich history of resistance. The Philippines only 36 years ago, more than that, ousted a dictator. And then that dictator came to Hawaii, more connections. Right, there's huge movements of Hawaiian peoples for their self-determination. Both nations, both Hawaii and the Philippines, have kicked out the US military at least once, kicked out the military from Kaho'olawe, and kicked out the US military bases in 1991 from the Philippines. It can be done. And these people's movements are proof that it can be done and it can be done again. We want to push that there's a lot of bleak things that connect our communities, both in Hawaii and the Philippines, but also this rich history of solidarity and resistance and people power that spans time and place from all the islands of the Philippines and in Hawaii. Just for example, these two pictures, one is on the Mauna Filipino youth groups and HiCHRP on the Mauna, and then HiCHRP with indigenous peoples in Kalinga, both lending solidarity to the Mauna Kea struggle. This top picture is hundreds of people who are concerned with the Philippines coming together to resist fascism and dictatorship in the Philippines. We have countless examples of this over time, and this is what we'll do, and this is how we will win. To get involved, if you're like, oh, I want to do that, I want to help us win, get involved. Join an organization if you're not in one already. If you're in an organization, you know, do internal education, do external education, link and raise the issues that are important to your organization or to you as a person, to these overall issues of imperialism, of capitalism, of whatever connects us. Organizing the most important, and we organize so that we can mobilize. We want to show up to each other, show up for our communities, for oppressed peoples around the world. And one or two such examples are to shut down Red Hill. That's something that everybody can get involved in so easily, so quickly. There's activities almost every day. We have to win because this is our lives. This is our water, and everyone is affected. Help us organize and mobilize to stop the killings in the Philippines. Show up to our actions, and lobby our elected representatives and sign on to the Philippine Human Rights Act. If you want more information, it's HiCHRP. Just Google HiCHRP and you can sign on. If you have an organization, if you know other organizations, make them sign on. If you're not in Hawaii, if you're in other, if you're in a state on the continent, lobby your representatives. We don't want another penny to go to the Philippine government when they use it to strike fear, to kill activists, to kill farmers, indigenous peoples, women, and so on. And like RC said, there's an election coming up and we are looking for election observers. If you are particularly brave and want to help observe, I've been an observer before in the 2010 elections. Granted, it might be more dangerous now with the COVID, as well as two dictator families vying for the presidency or a non-election scenario possibly. But if you want to get involved in that, or if you want to support it somehow, HiCHRP, our global, is facilitating a election observer mission. And thanks, Mary. So individuals and organizations can endorse the Philippine Human Rights Act. And if you want to do if you want us to do an education or presentation to your friends or family, we can definitely set that up and do that. So this song, RC, can you talk about this song before we play it?
I only know a little bit about this song, but it's a very popular kind of like rock, progressive rock song. But it's, if you're an activist in the Philippines, you know this song very well. But it's, some of the lines in the song are derived from a poem, like anti-violence poem written by someone. Yeah, I just know it by heart. I don't know the history of it.
Children begging in the streets at night, knocking on cars till the morning light. People standing in line for a kilo of rice. Welcome to the dark ages, the era of lies. Dreams of progress, of visions gone mad. Minjola still drenched with innocent blood. Demolition men rumbles through Smoky Mountain homes. Darkness indeed, justice dressed in gloom. But I'm gonna gently into the night, rage against the dying of the light. Sing a song about this terrible sight, rage until the lightning strikes. Go not gently, go not gently, go not gently and rage with me. Go not gently, go not gently, go not gently and rage with me. And the faces of the tyrants change, but poverty, pain, and murder remains, and the voices of truth are locked up in chains. Darkness remains, freedom in flames. But I'm gonna gently into the night, rage against the dying of the light. Sing a song about the terrible sight, rage until the lightning strikes. Go not gently, go not gently, go not gently and rage with me. against the dying of the light. Sing a song about this terrible sight. Rage until the lightning strikes. Go not gently, go not gently, go not gently and rage with me. Go not gently, go not gently, go not gently and rage with me. Rage with me. Come on, baby, rage with me. Rage with me. Rage with me. Come on, baby, rage with me.
If you're ever at a large action in the Philippines, you can't go to one without hearing this song being played. So now we want to open up for discussion. If folks have questions, if folks have comments, if folks want to offer things that they want to do. I'm gonna stop screen sharing so that we can see each other. Please turn on your cameras if you're in a place that you can do that. That would be great. Unmute. And let's have an open conversation.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and just thank Manang Arsi and Yoko for sharing all that information with us. I know it's a lot to take in, and probably a lot of us are familiar with some of these issues, but it's just really, really important to hear the details, to hear the facts, to hear the statistics and the numbers, and just really understand the magnitude of how much really the US is doing to support the crimes against humanity that are happening in the Philippines, and how that connects back to some of the real kind of real-time issues that are happening for folks in Hawaii, and obviously for people who are in the Philippines too, going into election season, just historically like a really violent time for the Philippines. So there's a lot of stuff kind of coming to a head, and of course COVID is making that, magnifying a lot of these issues. I didn't see any questions in the chat, but I'm wondering if anyone has anything that they want to, feel free to just jump in or put it in the chat and I can read it out loud. And I kind of wanted to kick us off by asking, because both of you have been to the Philippines multiple times, you've gone on various projects and have worked, back and forth for a while. And I'm wondering, I don't know if each of you can think of a time or a moment where you really felt that connection between Hawaii and the Philippines, maybe personally, like a moment where you're like, oh, wow, this is like really, why I'm here, why I'm doing this, or anything that you really might want to share from your time in the Philippines doing human rights work.
I can go. My most recent time in the Philippines was 2019. We had an HiCHRP friendship and learning trip, and we were in Kalinga. So we were in the indigenous communities of the Cordilleras, and we know that there are a lot of people with Cordilleran background in Hawaii as well. So we wanted to make that connection. That's why we went. We had Manang Grace and Malaya with us, who are also from the region. So really connecting it to them personally. When we were talking, or when the community, and especially the women, were talking about how they protected their land from Chevron or from the Chico River Dam, just different experiences over the decades of culturally protecting the land by putting their bodies on the line, and especially women. It really reminded me, or like it's like so similar to what was happening on the Mauna at the same exact time, right? Of particularly elderly women like kupuna, putting their bodies on the line to protect their ancestral domain. And you can't get any clearer than that. It's like exactly the same struggle. And the perpetrators are also the same.
Yeah, thanks, Yoko. I don't know, Manang, RC, do you have anything you want to share?
I couldn't think of something very specific to answer that question. Although I wanted to kind of share about more about the connection between, you know, the resistance in the Philippines and what are the potential resistance that we could generate here in Hawaii as Filipinos, right? Because I think there's that big concept of settler colonialism where, and I have to bring it up because it's very important. You know, like, you know, our presence here as migrants or as settlers, are we contributing to the more subjugation or colonization or oppression of the Native Hawaiian or who actually owns the land, who are you know, this is their land. Yeah, so I think at least I could say that we Filipinos in Hawaii should always keep that in mind too, you know, like how to always have that lens of connecting our history before we came to Hawaii and see how we can actually help become allies to the indigenous peoples here and get the justice that they deserve to. For we really have the similar histories here, and we could learn from each other. We could help each other's struggles. Yeah, it's very broad statement there, but I think that's what I can share at this point.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually just such an important point to remember. And, you know, I'm sorry that we didn't do like a proper land acknowledgement kind of statement at the beginning of this and just kind of really situating, you know, what both of our orgs do. And I think so much of what Laing has really been learning in the past couple of years as an organization that's doing cultural reclamation, as we're trying to connect back to our roots as Filipinos in the diaspora. Part of that learning is also understanding everything that we talked about, but then also how we can and are contributing to the continued oppression of Native Hawaiians or other Native peoples. I mean, we have people in the room from Massachusetts and from other places too. So I think that question of solidarity, not in just our own learning, but in our action as well, is really important, and really just making sure that we are taking liberties to be there in solidarity, to make statements, to sign statements. And I liked that you shared those pictures of different Filipino groups on the Mauna, Yoko, because I think that was a big question within our community, is like, well, is this our struggle? Thank you, Clarissa, thanks for coming. You know, is this our struggle? What do Hawaiians want from us as well? And I think the same question for the Philippines: what do Filipinos, you know, what do indigenous peoples in the Philippines want from Filipinos of the diaspora? And maybe that's a question for you guys too, like what are Filipinos asking of us? And I think you guys have been pretty clear that like they need solidarity, they need that the vocalization of some of these issues, especially because of the way that activists have been red tagged and have been silenced and do face imprisonment and, you know, incarceration and death and all of these things that they're facing. It does actually take external pressure as well, from people like you guys and from other folks too. Yeah, I'm wondering if there are any other questions. I can just ask a million questions, but I don't want to. I will also maybe briefly mention, unless someone else wants to cut me off, but when you mentioned, Yoko, the older women and the Chico River Dam and the actions that they took, I know that there were like some really specific things that just in terms of using the body. And I know that there are stories and documentation of this, but the people who were responding, like there's also this element of like on the Mauna, the police officers and the soldiers were also Kanaka, right? That we know that there's this internal conflict within our communities where we're used to police each other. And I also just kind of want to draw this connection back to that element as well, that the women who are on the lines using their bodies in the many various ways that they do, that the men who are policing the situation are also the relatives and friends and community of the people who are withholding that access to the land itself. And there's, that is just another way that these connections kind of keep going deeper and deeper in the way that these systems, the larger military and police systems, kind of pit us against each other, which, again, just another connection that I'm thinking about. But yeah, I'll stop talking. Who's got a question or a comment or anything or a frustration that you would like to share? Or maybe we can just be really direct and ask people. I'm curious as to like why people wanted to come today, or what actions you've already taken. Maybe, I know there's some people in the room here who are already involved, but maybe there are people who aren't, and you can also put it in the chat if you feel shy and you don't want to voice activate. And then Yoko says, yeah, maybe we can just hear some takeaways, or any reflections that you have is totally fine too. Don't feel the need to like think of a profound question.
I'll also stop the recording.
Oh yeah, okay, great. Thanks, Yoko.